the question was asked, is the coronavirus from Satan or is it from God? Jim, before I put some things up on the screen here, would you like to say anything about that? Not that I want to put you on the spot call, but go ahead and make comment on that if you want to.
Oh boy, where would you begin? You begin again with the sovereign character and nature of God. Nothing happens that is outside of God's control. Nothing happens that's outside of God's control. Is God the initiator of this virus, say maybe as a judgment on mankind? If I understand my Bible right, the next time God moves in judgment, there will be undeniable catastrophe will come across humankind. And this is a catastrophe, there's no question about that. But the scale of the catastrophes that God's word shows us for the future judgment is just unparalleled, even with our current one. Is this an evidence of God's disapproval of the world, or is it his removal of restraint from, God restrains evil in the world? Has God just removed a little restraint to allow these things to happen? That's possible. And is it that this is just a much more vivid and rapid evidence of the effects of sin, that God has maybe just moved a limiting hand on the ravages of sin for a little while, and what we're really seeing is maybe another aspect of the implications of sin in the world, that sin has caused disease, disaster, all these things have come as a result of sin, and maybe God has just stepped back a little and allowed a little more evidence of the way sin affects the whole of humanity. So I guess that's not a straight answer to a straight question, but I guess I just probably don't have as easy an answer as is it from God or from Satan. I just struggle just to pinpoint that one, to be honest with you.
I thought it was a very, very good question, Jim. And
absolutely.
Just as you said, I almost wanted to say yes and no, because some of the things that I was thinking about just as I was mulling over the question were some of them you have touched about. First of all, nothing happens without God's knowledge or his permission, but he is not the author of suffering and disease. They are the result of sin. But it's good for us to know. That's why I wanted to start with giving some of those attributes of God and speaking about the fact that he is all-knowing and all-powerful and so on. Nothing happens without God's knowledge and his permission, but he's not the author of sin, not the author of suffering, and he's not the author of disease. Suffering and disease are the results of sin. Now, the flip side of that coin is this. Satan is not all-powerful or all-knowing. This is something that's very important for us to know. Satan is not as God is. Satan does not know everything. Satan is not omnipresent. He's not everywhere in the world. It's amazing the number of people who say, the devil made me do something, as if he was, sitting there on their shoulder. But simultaneously, in another part of the world, someone else is saying, the devil made me do it. Well, not possible, because the devil's not omnipresent, okay? The devil is not as God is, and he's certainly not all-powerful. And we're going to see just in a moment or two that although he's not all-powerful and he's not all-knowing, everything that Satan does is subject ultimately to the control of God. And here's a couple of verses that I want to put up. Some of us have been listening within the last few days to some very helpful ministry from Joe. this point has been made when we've been listening to the ministry about Job. The Lord said unto Satan, behold, all that he has, all that Job has, is in your power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. When it came to Satan striking Job and taking away his family and all his flocks and herds and all the possessions that Satan had, God said, you can go this far and you can't go any further. So even Satan, when he was troubling Job as he did, he could only go as far as God permitted him to go. And then you see that again the second time, whenever Satan comes and he says to the Lord, if you skin for skin, he says, if you put your hand on his flesh, he's going to curse God and die. And the Lord says to Satan, behold, he's in thine hand, but save his life. So Job at that point was immortal because God had said, don't touch his life. So with all that happened to Job, he was actually, for the time being, he was immortal. He was untouchable because God had said, don't touch his life. So when we're thinking about is it from God or is it from Satan, we need to remember that God's not the author of illness and he's not the author of disease. These are the results of sin. But even all of these dreadful things that happen in our world, they are all, as Jim has been telling us, they are all within the scope of God's absolute sovereignty. Nothing happens without his permission. Nothing happens that's without his control. And he's not the author of these unpleasant things in the sense that they are the results of the curse and of the fall. But nothing happens outside of God's control. Does anybody want to ask any questions about that? Or Jim, do you want to add anything further to that?
No, that's good, Stephen. I think
anybody want to ask anything about that? You need to remember, if you're speaking, you need to have your microphone on.
So Stephen, for the point of the discussion, are we drawing a clear distinction then between the virus caused by sin, as in the fall, rather than the devil or Satan? Is there a distinction there that we could tease out?
Yes, I mean, you would know much more about viruses and what they actually are. They're not living beings, as I understand it, but they're similar in some respects to tiny little microorganisms, even though they're not living beings themselves. But ultimately, they are, in the way that they cause damage to human cells and so on, they are the result of the product of a fallen creation, the product of sin. The book of Romans tells us that it was because of one man's disobedience that sin entered into the world, and death because of sin. And so everything that pertains to death, and this pertains to death, this ultimately leads to death. So everything that pertains to death is as a result of sin. And as I said, these are huge things that human minds, much bigger than mine and much more spiritual than mine, have grappled with. But what we need to do, especially young folks, is we need to just anchor ourselves in the absolute certainty that God is good and that God is in control. Okay, and after that, we start to work out some of the apparent aberrations. We work those things out within the context of the goodness and the sovereignty of God. Jim?
Just to underline something we've touched on, that sin is not rampant, uncontrolled, and unrestrained. God, by his grace and by his Spirit, has restrained evil in the world, else we would all be destroyed immediately. And so I think in certain periods of history, God just doesn't take the restraint away, but maybe just loosens the restraint a bit and allows lessons to be learned by people, you know, or tries to allow lessons to be learned by people by allowing sin maybe to be seen in a bit more acute focus than it has been before. And just to turn the conversation to what the brother, I don't know who the brother is, who said earlier about the Lord's coming. One of those characteristics of the Lord's coming is that restraint will be removed on the earth and sin will be seen in its fullest and most extreme form. And that'll take all sorts of manifestations. And so, while I don't think this is that, it's certainly a precursor to that and should be a salutary lesson to those who are not saved, that if God does remove his restraint and his grace, who knows the horrors that await those on earth, never mind in eternity.
Yeah. Norman and I grew up on a diet of Saturday morning tag wrestling and so on. We grew up in the era of Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks and so on. And back in the day, Norman, you remember there was some great tag teams. Well, Jim and I have worked like a tag team in quite a few settings, haven't we, Jim?
I won't tell you who Giant Haystacks is.
We've tagged a bit in Malawi, and we've tagged in Bulgaria, and we've tagged in a number of places. And so I pretty much knew that Jim was going to go there. We're starting to understand the way each other think. And I'm glad you did, Jim, because that was the very point that I was going to make and link it in with what Norman said. It's very, very clear. Thessalonians tells us that there is a restrainer in the world, and the restrainer is going to be taken away. And we have a description of the man of sin and how his influence will be unleashed in that day, because the one who, the King James Version says, who now letteth, who restrains, is going to restrain until he's taken out of the way. And then when the restraint is gone, that is when the church is gone, when the rapture takes place, there will be a removal of all restraint. And I agree with what Jim has said. What we're seeing just now is we hear people on the news talking about this is something of biblical proportions, or something of apocalyptic proportions. All that proves is that they have no idea what the world is going to be like when the restraint is actually removed. They have no comprehension about what the world is going to be like whenever the church and when the man of sin, who's working is, according to, as Thessalonians tells us, signs and wonders and so on, when he is given free rein, this world, the coronavirus is going to be like a picnic. And so is this the judgment of God? It might be, as Jim is saying, it might just be the relinquishing a little of restraint to give men and women and young people pause for thought. It's a great concern to me just now, if I might say this, it's a great concern to me just now that with no sport on the telly and no pubs to go to and no restaurants and coffee shops to go to, people are all renewing their Netflix accounts and all the rest of it because they want to fill the silence. This is not a time, I would respectfully say, this is not a time to fill the silence. This is a time to allow God to speak to our hearts. And that may be speaking to believers, and it may be speaking to unbelievers. This is a time to allow God to speak with his still small voice. So let's not drown out the still small voice of God with noise, whenever that noise might come. William, did you want to say anything?
No, I'm nodding. I'm agreeing with everything you're saying. It did occur to me earlier that along the lines you were thinking, this is a rare opportunity when the world has really stopped, and wouldn't it be lovely if we could get the gospel to them? It struck me several times through the week when people were coming in desperation. They're just grasping for something, and this is. It really struck me. I could see it on their faces time after time. People know that this is an unusual circumstance. This is a strange event. Yeah, it's but no, I've been agreeing with everything you've been saying so far.
Just
So-
another angle, Stephen, if I could mention, I think it shows just how easy it is for God to bring the greatest of the world powers crashing down in a moment of time.
Yeah.
By the release of a tiny microorganism, which probably doesn't even fulfill the definitions of what true life is, a little bundle of RNA in a fat capsule. God has touched every aspect of human society:
Mhm.
health, welfare, entertainment, social, travel, and it's just come crashing down. And that is biblical, isn't it? I mean, there's so many examples of God doing that.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about King Herod. Do you remember whenever King Herod came and he gave his oration, probably there at the stadium that we've visited in Caesarea Philippi, or in Caesarea by the sea, and they all said, "It's the voice of God and not of a man." And he took the adulation, and what did God do? God just sent a little worm, just a little worm, and that little worm came and destroyed that man. He just dropped like that and was gone. And this is even smaller than a little worm. This is, as you've said, it barely even qualifies for the description of a microorganism, because it's hardly even an organism, but a tiny little virus has brought the world to its knees.